Hi there. This is Bryony Rose Smith, live from the Forbidden Library. Welcome! Before we start the stream in earnest, there is a thing. Da, 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 da. I finished my third book since landing here. And you know what it was? It was... Da, 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 da. She Who Rises by Rachel Arsenal? Like Arsenal? That's... I've been trying to figure out how to say that. I hope I said it right. Hello! Just quickly telling you about a book I just read. And this one, it was a solid urban fantasy, which the title is a lot more epic than it actually was. But it was fun for urban fantasy because we didn't have a masquerade or anything to deal with, and there was actually kind of a good reason why most people didn't know about magic and stuff. Good book. And now 9,997 to go until freedom. Woo! And now we can get on with today's stream, which is Exordium once more. Okay. We are six streams into this book. Time to give a very big summary of the book so far. 70% of the book I'm about to give you a summary on. Let's see how well my memory serves. Right. First chapter was a dude who was down on his luck, pretty desperate. He went into a dungeon, the Forbidden Dungeon. He shouldn't go in there. Everyone who goes in there dies. He finds a magic item, and guess what? He dies. Then we go to our second character, who's also down on his luck. He is also a guy who goes into dungeons to try sell things. Can't find anything in his not usual haunts, getting desperate. Goes to the pub, tries to find some work. Instead finds another bunch of desperate people who need money, who are considering going into said Forbidden Dungeon. He goes with them, thinking in a group he'll be fine, right? It's all good. I am fine. How are you? Train of thought. Yes, so they go into said Forbidden Dungeon, where they can't find anything good because everything good is so old it's bloody rotting away. Pretty much turns to dust, literally turns to dust as they touch it. But they find said magic item. And, ooh, exciting. What are you playing today? Wait, I could probably just check my subs. Probably just go check your channel. And then the Draugr that killed the first guy appeared to try to kill them because they have the magical item. They don't want the magical item to leave the dungeon. So he tries to get rid of the magical item because they're coming after him for that. But the magical item's stuck to him. The MacGuffin says no. So instead, the rest of the party leave him in the dungeon because he wants them to get away to safety. And he ends up falling down a cliff into spiderwebs. Luckily, the spiders aren't there yet. So he just gets himself back up, carries on, tries to find his own way out, finds more spiderwebs, finds dead spiders. Spiders try to eat him. Magical item says no, explodes all the spiders, turns into a magical ring and a magical talking fox, who is a good boy. Who is a good boy and wants to save the world. Oh, Sniper Elite. I don't know much about Sniper Elite except for those sweet ass X-ray slow-mo shots. That is it. And my phone has an alarm set for 7 that I keep forgetting to turn off. Anyway. He wanders through with said magical fox. They fall down many more places, including a waterfall at one point, because if they haven't been beaten enough, eventually they find a way out and get out. But the Draugr are still on their asses. But the Draugr kind of melt in a small river outside because flowing water says fuck you to bad magic. And they're dead. The fox was a little bit hurt though, so he had to carry him, and the fox also wants to split off from him because main character Nox just wants to go back to his mum and help him out, but the fox wants to go on an epic adventure to save the world. But can't do that just yet because he's too injured, so Nox has to look after him. Then they end up in a forest trying to travel back because they ended up miles away from their actual home, where they set up camp, and then what seemed to be some kind of werewolf-like creature attacked them. It wasn't called that. I can't remember what the book actually called it, but it was basically a werewolf attacked them, and they were saved by a bunch of orcs who are actually quite nice. They have no intention of eating them and actually invited them to have a meal with them. And Nox doesn't really like them because Nox has been told all his life that orcs are scary and bloodthirsty and stuff. But they're actually just genuinely quite nice. That's about where we left off. Whoa. I'm gonna hate having to give these summaries when we're like 90% of the way through. Yeah, they are nice orcs. They are friendly. Friendly orcs. Let's read more about the friendly orcs. The next morning, Nox woke up to the sound of a fox snoring in his ear. What does the fox snore? The whiskers brushing against his face. He backed slowly away from Zyuk, trying not to disturb him. Nyuluk is the name of the lady orc, who seems to be the leader, just for the record. And one of the male orcs were standing at the far edge of the camp, taking the last watch of the night. The others were fast asleep on the ground, near the smouldering fire, their snores filling the cold morning air. It is a nice surprise, because I was sitting there when I was first reading it, like, oh, please be nice, please be nice, please be nice, orcs. He deserves something nice. And they were. It's great. She looked up as Nox pushed himself to a sitting position, giving him a nod. You live to see the dawn, she said. Kept my promise. Nox grumbled in return, ignoring her prideful grin and turning away. Ah, spoil sport. He didn't want to deal with her right now, not while he was still trying to come back to consciousness. Rubbing his forehead, he leaned forward, pulling his knees tight against him to keep away the morning chill. There was a knot in his stomach from the dreams he'd been having. Oh yeah, the dreams have been kind of wild. I suppose I should fill in that in a summary. So you got the three eyes that seem to need him and the fox to go on some kind of epic adventure to do something. Some kind of magical trapped god thing, I don't know what it is, and an old lady who kind of gave him like an actual sleep rather than weird visions. Don't know what's going on. That's all magical mystery things right now. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't recall more than the face of an old woman smiling at him. He had no idea who she was, but something about her made him feel calm down to his core. It was a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time, even if his stomach seemed to have other ideas. Maybe it was just a bit of undigested meat from the night before? After all, it was the first time he'd eaten a substantial meal in over a week. Nux pushed himself up and left the campsite for a moment, disappearing into the tall grass to relieve himself. Ah! A book that actually notices that characters need to pee sometimes. Doesn't just ignore it. There was a low mist rolling down from the mountains. I'm just going to move where the chat is, and I might be able to see it. There we go. Yeah, perfect. Oh, nope, go up. There was a low mist rolling down from the mountains, and dew clung to every available surface. Pinks and blues filled the sky. He couldn't tell if the sun had already risen beyond the mountains. Craning his neck, he looked long and hard at the forested hills, standing between him and Kald, where his mother lay waiting. He still didn't know how far north or south they'd travelled in the hollow, but he'd have a better idea in a couple days. That was, if the orcs ever let him go. Oh, Noxie, they're being so nice to you. He glanced back towards the camp and took a few steps before he stopped. Nullock and the other watcher were turned away from him. If he wanted to, he could duck down into the grass and disappear for good. For a half moment he considered it, but then he thought of Zuck. What would the fox do without him? He didn't know anything about the world or how it could hurt him. The first moment he spoke in front of a person, he'd be strung up by the holy knights and turned into a shawl, or worse. But then again, why did he care? Zuck wasn't his responsibility. Yes, he is. Look after that boy. And Knox made it more than clear that he intended to part ways at some point. The more he thought about it, the more he realised he'd grown attached to the critter against his better judgment. 'Cause he is fuzzy wuzzy. He cannot resist. He shook his head. The urge was going to get him nothing but trouble. The sound of rustling grass caught his attention. He looked back over his shoulder. Nullock was pushing her way towards him, the greenery parting easily below her waist, even though it nearly came up to his chest. In the early morning even, the light, he could make out more details about her. Her skin was a dark grey-green, giving her a natural camouflage with her surroundings. She had her black hair pulled back into a bun, tied with a leather cord. Beads strung throughout, made of shiny bits of stone and carved bone. Her clothing was mostly thick leathers, made soft and pliable with use, although they were blood-stained in places. What surprised him most was the multitude of pink scars running all across her body. It was clear she'd led a life of turmoil, and from what she said about the Holy Knights, Knox had a good idea where most of them had come from. He had a couple of his own. "Not thinking of running off from us, are ya?" she asked, taking a place beside him at the edge of the river. "Your friend will be sad to see you go." "Not yet," Knox grumbled. He still didn't trust her, even if they did have an enemy in common. "Look," she sighed, "I know you're not overly fond of us, but I want to make sure both you and that little fox get to wherever you're going safely. Where are you headed?" "Like an idiot. Back to Cald." "Cald?" she scoffed. "Why would anyone want to go there? That place is barely better than a sewer unless you're a wealthy noble." She looked over him. "No offence, but you don't strike me as rich." "It's my home," Knox replied simply. "And I have promises to keep, people to take care of." "I understand that." Nullock paused for a moment, then held out a hand. "Will you at least let us escort you over the mountains safely? We can't take you near the city, but we can at least make sure there's nothing but the grass between you and your home." "That's so nice." Knox glared at her hands suspiciously. "What's the catch?" "No catch. Like I said, I'm fond of that little critter, 'cause he is soft and fluffy and no one can resist." "Nothing nice ever comes for free," Knox looked her in the eye. "You and I both know that." Nullock's warm smile faded. "Well, if there has to be a price, let me give you something simple. The next time you meet an orc, don't judge him on sight." She thrust her little hand further. I was about to say, her hand's not going to be little. Why did I say that? She thrust her hand a little further forward. "Let them tell you who they are, themselves." Knox thought it over a moment. It was a cheap price for guarded passage and a promise he'd never be held to. That meant it was free and not to be trusted. But it seemed there was little choice anyway. Nulloch wasn't going to take no for an answer, and he wasn't confident he could make it through the mountains on their own after what they'd seen the night before. Zyuk was still recovering, and almost useless in battle, and both of them were still weak with exhaustion. With a single nod, he reluctantly lifted his hand and placed it in Nulloch's massive one. Fine. You can take us over the mountain, but no further. I've already got enough on my plate with Zyuk, and whatever kind of power he wields. If I'm seen with orcs, I might as well kill myself to save me the torture. Yeah, I understand, she replied, shaking his hand lightly. Pulling away, she turned back towards the south, staring across the river and plains, butting up against the edge of the mountain. You know, I'm surprised you don't have any powers yourself. Nox's hand immediately went to his bandana. Too late, as he tried to make it look like he was waving a bug, but Nulloch didn't seem to notice or care. What? Why'd you say that? You survived the Hollow. You have a talking fox and a strange glowing crystal. Doesn't that make you sound like a... Doesn't that sound like a mage to you? All of those things were accidents. I'm not a mage, I swear. I'm not a car thief, I swear. I just happened to fall into this car. He sighed, relieved she hadn't seen his ears. I only meant to see the Hollow for a couple of hours, not get chased by a Draugia into the depths of the underground. Seems an awful lot of luck to survive all that, especially for someone as skinny as you. What about any of that is lucky? Nox scoffed. I've been nearly killed several times by all manner of horrors. Not to mention, the moment one of the knights sees Zyuk with me, I'm a dead man. Nulloch turned to look at him, her brows knitted together. I'll never understand why the Relians fear magic so much. It's a beautiful gift. A blessing that not all have bestowed upon them. And one that is fading from this world. She shook her head, turning back to the river. It's surprising you can't feel that, especially with your elf blood. Get called out, bitch. What? He stammered, adrenaline spiking through his system as he stepped back. I'm not an elf. Why would you say that? Your bandana may be covering your ears, but it doesn't cover your smell, she said, tapping on the side of her nose. Orcs have keen senses. Just like I can tell that you're at least half elf. I can also tell you your fox companion isn't actually a fox. Nox's panic was replaced by a sudden curiosity. Do you know what he is? Nope, she replied, shaking her head. I've never smelled anything like that in my life. However, it's not unpleasant. So I don't think there's anything to worry about. She paused for a moment. But you know, one of the shamans of the tribe might know. But you said they're waiting for you to scout ahead. They're weeks away in the north, aren't they? No, she smiled, looking down at him. They're waiting in a mountain valley, only a day's walk from here. Yes. Smells like friend. She paused. You know, it would be on the way, and a safe place to rest for the night. She looked him over, her smile widening. And we could at least outfit you with some warmer clothes and a basic supplies for your journey back to Keld. What do you say? They are so nice! Nogs, be nice back, okay? I don't know. I really need to get home, he replied, thinking of his mother. There are things I have to do. Sweetie, you're not gonna get home in your state! Protagonists, bro. Nox looked back to the camp where Zyuk was just pushing himself up from his spot near the fire. He stretched out his front legs and leaned back, yawning widely with his tail puffed up. Daw. It was possible that the shamans would have the answers he was looking for. Maybe he could even find someone to go with him on his journey. Even though Nox had grown attached to him and wanted to protect him and wanted to pet him and wanted to keep him forever. No, but he still wasn't planning on striking out into the world looking for answers. The mysteries of the Clavis and their strange eyes were of no concern to him. Be that as it may, he didn't want to leave Zyuk stranded either, or trapped in Keld with no way out. That would be dangerous for both of them. At the very least, he could give him a shot at getting the answers he wanted. Fine, Nox said with a sigh. But I'm only doing it for Zyuk, mind you. Not because I trust you or you're kind, for fuck's sake. But only one night. I need to get home. Niluk smiled anyway. Thank you for allowing us to help. I still don't understand why you want to help. Do people need a reason to be nice? Exactly! Nox, calm your tits. Yeah, because they want something. Niluk shook her head. You have a lot to learn about the world, little one. What are you talking about? Oh, this is Zyuk. What are you talking about? Zyuk asked as he came limping over, his ears perked in their direction. The trip over the mountains was easier than Nox expected. He no longer had to carry Zyuk, since the fox was more than happy to ride on the shoulders of Niluk. Story, yes, much story. Dr. Magicborn. Together they chatted happily, as Zyuk drilled her for information about the orc culture. Nox caught pieces of their conversation, but kept mostly to himself. He was too busy worrying about his mother's state in Keld. What he'd do when he finally got home, and how he'd get rid of the ring before he arrived. The orcs followed a small game trail that led through the easiest parts of the mountain, keeping mostly away from the steep inclines and cliff faces. Smirt. With Niluk in the lead, they followed it up the rocky hillside and through the trees. The trail was overgrown and looked rarely used, but along its sides were berry plants here and there that the orcs pointed out as edible. Very useful information. See, they're so nice! Fruit was a rarity in Licorice, and typically reserved for only the very wealthy. Ah, the pineapple issue. Although Nox was suspicious, he couldn't help himself from trying one after watching the others. The bulbous little berries were bright red and full of seeds when he bit into them, but the sweet juice that spilled across his tongue set his senses on fire. He pulled another from the bush, then another, tasting each of them with gusto. He learned quickly that the ones that came away from the plant easily were the sweetest, while the ones he had to fight for were tart and left a strange feeling on his tongue. As they walked, he continued to pick, eating as many as he could find, knowing he might never see them again. The sun eventually rose up over the hills before it began to make its way toward the western horizon. As the day reached late afternoon, Nullock brought the group to a halt at the peak of a mountain. Nox took a place beside her and nearly gasped at what he saw. The steep sides of the mountain sank away below them. Far below was a treeless valley filled with huts, low fires, and dozens of orcs milling about the area. There had to be more than 60 of them in all, and possibly more inside the makeshift homes. It seemed impossible that such a large group had evaded the notice of the Holy Knights. As they trekked their way south towards the endless sand sea, but somehow, here they were. "Here it is," Nullock said, gesturing down the village. "The last of the Ninbanda tribe." "That's amazing," Zirk replied excitedly. "I've never seen so many people in one place." It's less than half of what we used to be," Nullock sighed, her voice filled with sorrow. "But it's enough to keep us going. Once we reach the sands, we'll start building our numbers again." "Oh, that's okay. Hope you have a wonderful stream, Luke. Have fun. Shoot many bad guys." Keeping children safe is hard enough without walking through the dangerous territory every day. Although it's just like everywhere else, even having children seems to be difficult these days. Bye! "Is that one of the things you talked about? Life dwindling away?" Zirk asked, looking up at her with a melancholy expression. "Nox mentioned it too." "I'm afraid so. But why is it happening?" "I don't know." She turned back towards the village, pointing down to it. "And I'm not sure if the shamans do either, but maybe they can help in some way. They are far more connected to Licorice and its magic than the rest of us." Zirk nodded from her shoulder. "Take me to them." "First, you'll have to meet the chief. She decides who's allowed inside the village." Nyuk glanced over her shoulder at Nox. "I can't take you inside without her permission." "You didn't think to mention that this morning?" Nox asked, the annoyance clear in his voice. "What do we have to do to prove we're worthy of being permitted?" "Nothing. She'll just want to talk to you and get a feel for what kind of people you are." She narrowed her gaze at Nox. "So I suggest you be on your best behavior." "I've got nothing to hide," Zirk said, his tail twitching back and forth. "I'm just excited to meet some new people and maybe get some answers." "Let's hope this all goes well then." Nilek gestured to the rest of the crew. "Come on. We need to be down this mountain before dark. Hurry up!" Da-da-da! Chapter 20. I'm glad we get to meet more orcs. Get a whole village worth. And they're all nice. If Nox could just get it through his very, very thick skull that people can be nice. Because he freaked out on Best Boy, Best Dwarf, Jaeger as well at the start of the story, so it makes sense that he's so resistant to it, but it is low-key annoying. Get with the program, Nox. Get with the program. But then he's still in this whole reluctant hero phase of this hero journey. We are still on step 2 of this goddamn hero journey. When will we get to step 3? Will it be in chapter 21? I doubt it, but here we go. It took the group over an hour to reach the bottom of the mountain. The sun was already dipping below the horizon as they reached the edge of the village. Nullock left 2 of the male orcs to stand guard over Zyuk and Nox as she went to fetch the chief. The orcs in the village noticed their arrival, a few of them speaking in hushed tones and pointing in their direction. Subtle. It was clear from the looks on their faces that they were just as concerned about Nox as he was of them. But he didn't understand why. The orcs were powerful warriors who not only outnumbered him, but were at least 4 times his size. It made him wonder if Nullock had been more truthful than he'd first thought. More than a few ducked into their huts and came back, wielding a sword, axe, or hammer, as if ready for battle. Nox felt his fingers twitch at his side, wanting to have his spear at the ready. But he knew making an aggressive move would bring the wrath of the village down upon Zyuk and himself. Instead, he stood there with his arms crossed, tapping his foot nervously with his eyes fixed on the hut Nullock had disappeared into for a few moments. Moments before. Nox was getting more anxious and impatient as the moments crawled by. A crowd was starting to gather inside the village before Nullock finally reappeared from the hut, followed closely behind by another orc, even taller than her. The chief, or so Nox assumed, had long, dark, braided hair. The sides of her head clean shaven so that the mottled green skin shone through. A metal breastplate covered her upper torso, made of enough steel to feed Nox and his mother for months if he were to sell it in Kald. Over her left shoulder she carried an iron maul that was bigger than his head with a full metal handle. Nox couldn't stop his jaw from falling open. He'd never seen so much iron and steel in his life. Her weapon alone was worth a small fortune. It could have purchased a farm or a business outright, giving him a lifetime supply of income and food. He had no idea where the orcs had gotten such riches, but as he glanced around the small crowd, he realized she wasn't alone in her wealth. Many of the villagers had their own small pieces of armor or steel weapons. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Poor boy. Poor baby. He's just so poor. You, the chief called, leveling her maul at Nox's head as she approached, her voice commanding, "Who are you? What are you doing in the wilds by yourself?" She stopped only a couple feet away from him, leaning down close, a growl forming in her throat. "And was it you? And who sent you? Was it the Primes?" Nox glanced at the spiked maul only a few inches from his head and swallowed hard. This was it. This was how he was gonna die. And all because he trusted an orc. We got lost in the hollow, he stammered, glancing between her furious dark eyes and the mole, terrified of what she'd do next. I'm a scrounger. No, nobody sent me. Yalak! The chief yelled, whipping around. "How dare you bring strangers into our midst? You're supposed to be scouting ahead with the other warriors. You know the knights are hot on our trail. Why do you dally with such trifling matters?" They were lost and in danger, Nullock replied, keeping her head bowed. Our code. You think the code matters when all of our lives are in danger? The chief bellowed. Look around you, you fool! There's not enough here to defend us if the knights come knocking. Forget the code. Guidelines rather than rules. Our way of life is threatened, and we stand on the precipice of extinction. And you want to follow rules? Oh no. There's no better time to follow the code than when things are most dire. An old hunched orc man said, stepping into the fray. He held a long gnarled staff in his bony hands, and he was covered in furs, feathers, dried plants, and leather pouches. Nox even spotted a rogue mushroom or two, seemingly growing from his cloak. Cool. That is why the Orcish code survives, because those in power understood its value in great times of need. Bah! The chief spat. Your emotions get the better of you, Chief Varfu, the old man said, pulling a small moldy pouch from inside his leather poncho. Go make this tea and sit a while. You'll feel better. It's a lot of pressure being an orc leader, I guess. The chief looked as if she wanted to strike the old man, but with the entire village edging closer to listen, she merely stood her ground, anger irradiating from every pore. I don't want your fucking tea. I want my people safe and out of the Jade Lowlands. Then stick to the code, he said softly, not backing down from her, and let your warriors do the same. Have it your way, and let us all die then, she snarled, and stomped away back to her hut, yelling at the others to get out of her way. My apologies, the old man said to Nullock, resting his wrinkled hand gently on her arm. Varfu's heart is in the right place, but she is consumed by fear. Do not hold it against her. Nullock nodded, finally lifting her head from its bowed position. Now tell me about your friends. Nullock took a deep breath. This is Nox and Zyuk, she replied, pointing to each of them. I found them on the other side of the mountains. They were being stalked by a Beldig. That was the word they used for werewolf, a Beldig. But we drove them off before it could attack. They claimed to have been lost in the hollow for some time. We were lost in the hollow, Zyuk said from Nox's shoulder. I thought you believed me, Nullock. My goodness, the old man chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the edges. Well, I didn't expect that, I must say. I do believe ya, Nullock said with a smile, especially since you can talk, and your friend here is a glowing crystal from deep underground. There's no doubt you were both in the hollow. The old man took a step towards Nox, lifting his nose in the air. He took a few deep whiffs of the evening breeze. Ah, a half-elf. Most intriguing. He reached out a hand towards Nox. My name is Witten Gruul. I am the head shaman of this tribe. Nox reluctantly took his cold-stained hand. Nox, I'm sorry, I was just contemplating the wording of cold-stained hand. I think that's very interesting. I think that's a pretty good way of saying a cold hand, because stained kind of makes it seem dirty. Is it stained with cold, or are they saying that it's dirty as well? Or both? Naru. Hodo. But she didn't. Naru Hodo at all. It's very nice to meet you, Nox, Witten Gruel replied, still holding onto his hand. He pulled Nox a little closer and turned his hand over, rubbing his thumb across the platinum ring on his middle finger. Well, Nox, it looks like you've gotten yourself into a bit of trouble of the magical variety. Nox pulled his hand away, taking a few steps back. Don't fuss, my dear boy. I mean you no harm, he smiled, leaning against his staff. I could sense this ring before you even got into the valley. I'm curious, how did you come across something so intriguing? We'd be happy to share, Zyuk replied quickly, not giving Nox a chance to respond. I am pleased to hear it. The old man pulled his furs a bit closer around him, knocking a mushroom off the side of it. Now, if you don't mind, these old bones of mine don't take kindly to the chill of the night. Would you join me for dinner and a warm fire? Without waiting for an answer, he turned and began to hobble away, heading into the village. Nox looked up at Niluk with an eyebrow raised. They hadn't gotten permission off the village chief to enter. Go up, she said, gesturing towards the old man. The shaman's word is law around here. You'll be fine. Yay! Got permission from the even higher up. Aren't you coming with us? Zyuk asked. I had duties of my own to tend to. You'll be well looked after. With that, she called to her 2 warriors, and the 3 of them headed back into the village. Nox hesitated for a moment, watching the old orc toddle away. Again, he felt a sudden urge to run, but there was a cold fear in his heart left over from the chief's outburst. She'd said that the holy knights were close by, trailing the orcs. It didn't seem wise to be with them if they were being pursued. But being in the wilderness by himself with the knights on the prowl seemed much more dangerous. Besides, he only planned on staying a single night. After that, Niluk had promised she would take them to the other side of the mountain. With tentative steps, Nox followed after the shaman, keeping a few feet behind at all times. The rest of the village watched him go with suspicious looks in their eyes. Whether they were concerned he'd hurt the shaman, or that he was a spy, he wasn't sure, but their stares made him uncomfortable. Nox was thankful when they finally reached the hut and slipped under the leather door flap, cutting them off from the rest of the village. Inside, there were furs spread over the floor, surrounding a small fire that burned low in a ring of stones. The walls were covered in plants, feathers, bones, and strange stones, not unlike the crystal that Nox carried with him. In one corner was a pile of furs, which he assumed was the shaman's bed. The interior smelled strongly of burning herbs, with a trail of white smoke funneling out a small opening in the roof. Please, take a seat, the old man said, gesturing to the ground near the fire. Nox sat down in the ring of stone, near the ring of stones, pulling Zyuk off his shoulders and placing him on the ground gently. The pair of them watched as the shaman hobbled around the hut, plucking things from the shelves while muttering to himself. After a moment, he returned to the fire with a full kettle and placed it over the embers. Ah! Tea! At his side, he dropped a few wooden cups and a pouch full of herbs. I find conversation pairs best with tea, don't you? I do too. Tea always makes everything better. He asked, looking at Nox. I don't know. I've never had any. Baby's never had tea? Never had tea? He glanced down at the fox. Is he having me on? I don't even know what tea is. Oh my god. They don't know what tea is. I don't even know the right expression for this. Tea is the best, though. Tea? My goodness! Now is not the time for laughing, old man. Now is the time for crying for their pitiful lives so far without tea. Wit and Gruel laughed. So many strange things happening all in one day. First, our warriors return with rescues in tow. One of them, a fox that talks, and now 2 people are sitting in my home that have never had tea. Will the wonders ever cease? Not to be rude. Oh, I'm sure you don't mean to be. Gruel smiled, turning towards Nox with a nod. But please continue. Okay. Nox paused for a moment. Not sure if the old man was joking or if he was being attentive. Please go on. Not really sure what's going on, Nox continued. Really, I'm just trying to get home to Kald, but Nolak said you might be able to help Zyuk. So I agreed to stop briefly here first. You did? Zyuk glanced up with a look of surprise on his face. You are a good friend. Aw. That's a generous judgment, but Zyuk already knows that his journey is not one I wish to take part in. Nox saw the fox's ears drop slightly. But I wanted to make sure he got a good start before we parted ways, especially with the knights nearby and how they'd react to his abilities. Ah, yes. All this nonsense about magic is being illegal. Wit and Gruel scoffed. King Ladari seems to revel in having power over others. Not only does he suppress his own people, but he tries to drive all others from his lands. And if he's not careful, he'll soon be a king with no subjects. And that doesn't make much of a king. Oh, this old man voice is going a bit weird. I'm just gonna splash some water on my throat via my mouth. Bah! He turned his attention to Zyuk. It's true the knights would probably kill you on sight. Or worse, bring you to the capital for experimentation. It's going a bit wonky. The voices are going wonky. I hear the king's vizier is extremely interested in oddities from the Hollow these days. He seems to be quite the collector. Yeah. Oh, I thought I'd skipped 2 pages. I was just checking. Sorry. That's why Nuluk told us. That's why I told Nuluk I'd come here. Nox replied. I don't want that to happen. Let's start with the basics then, Wit and Gruel said, pulling the kettle from the fire and filling each of the cups in turn before sprinkling a few herbs in each. He handed them across the fire before settling back in place. Tell me your story. Guess I'll start, Nox said, holding the warm cup gently in his hands. He took a deep breath and began. He launched into how he came to find himself in the hollow. He told Wittengruel about the strange room with the cylinder, and how it called to him with an ethereal sound it seemed only he could hear. He mentioned the Draugr coming to life and chasing him and his companions until they had no choice but to split up, the Draugr being strangely attracted to the cylinder. The plummet into the ravine seemed to make even Zyuk flinch. Then there were spiders, the dreams, and the eventual release of Zyuk, where the clavis transformed into a ring. From there, Zyuk was able to take over the majority of it, explaining things from his perspective. As Nox listened, he found it almost laughable how Zyuk described him, as if he was some sort of warrior hero fighting the Draugr with nothing but a spear and his own wits. I mean, that's exactly what you were, Nox. That's exactly what happened. Sweet boy. Doesn't even know how cool he is. It had been much different in his own mind, and a lot less heroic. Eventually the story wound its way back to the mountains, and the run-in with Bleedig and Nulloch and her group had saved them from. And after that, Nulloch led us back here, and now we're talking to you. Zyuk finished nodding his head. So what can you tell us? Wittengruel laughed. Ha! Oh, I'm sure I could tell you many things. What would you like to know? Do you know why Nox was chosen by the clavis? Who are the 3 pairs of eyes we kept seeing? I know I come from amongst the stars, but I can't seem to remember what I am or why I'm here. Is that something you might know? Might know too? For one so small, your questions are quite large. Wittengruel took a few sips of his tea, letting the silence fall between them. The cup seemed to cool enough that Nox lifted it to his lips. The liquid was bitter, but it had an earthy richness he hadn't expected. As the flavour developed across his tongue, he caught hints of a honey-like sweetness that reminded him of the smell of wildflowers on the plains. He glanced down at Zyuk, who was impatiently lapping it up, not breaking eye contact with the shaman. Nox wasn't sure if he was even tasting the tea, but merely filling the empty space between them. I do not know why your friend was chosen by this item, and I'm afraid I also don't know what it is. I can sense a powerful magic emanating from it. Something ancient, but it doesn't seem to want to reveal any of its secrets outwardly. Whatever it is, you'll have to find out for yourself. He glanced up at Nox. May I try something? Nox eyed the old man suspiciously. I guess. Give me your hand. Holding out his left hand with the ring on it, Nox watched as the man waved his hand over the ring, chanting softly under his breath as he closed his eyes. A moment later, the ring began to glow green, filling the hut with vernal light. Vernal light. Nox could feel the warmth emanating from the metal, a strange prickle across his skin that felt oddly familiar. Somehow he knew it to be the touch of magic, but he didn't understand why he knew it. The old man opened his eyes once again and examined the ring further, turning Nox's hands over as he did so. Well, that didn't help much, he sighed, letting go of the hand. The glow slowly faded. However, I will say that your friend is correct. The ring is bound to you. Unless you were to perish or lose your hand, I'd say you're stuck with it. Ugh, great, Nox sighed, pulling his hand back. Just what I was hoping for. The old man turned to Zuk. I also don't know what you are, or why you're here, small friend. This time, Whittingruel did not smile, but looked disappointed he didn't have an answer. I can tell you are not of this world, but I don't have a name for or knowledge of your kind. It was Zuk's turn to sigh, plopping his butt down on the ground. However, I might be able to help with the eyes. He turned to Nox. Can you tell me what they look like? Nox closed his eyes, bringing the dreams into his mind's eye. There was a dark blue pair with slitted pupils, a beady brown pair, a large black pair that looked as if the night sky had been spilled across them. He paused, but after I saw them, I saw something else. A massive dark figure, lightning and chains. The shaman hummed. That last figure sounds dark, but I'm afraid I have no reference for it. Another mystery. It's the one that drove the eyes away. They seem to be scared of it. That seems unlikely. Whittingruel smiled. The eyes you're describing are the same as the gods that once walked Licorice. Da da da! The gods are dead. Nox sighed. He couldn't believe he'd almost started believing this old geezer. Everyone knows that. Well, their bodies are dead, he replied. But it's not possible to truly kill a god. At least, not that I'm aware of. So you're telling me the gods, the ones that died over 1,000 years ago, are talking to me? Of course! Ugh, look, Gramps, Nox said, pushing himself to his feet. Tired of the charade. I don't know what kind of crazy mushrooms you've been brewing in here, but it's a bit beyond what I'm willing to believe. Belief has nothing to do with whether something exists or not, Whittingruel replied, his voice suddenly serious. You may believe the sky is red, but that doesn't stop it from being blue. What you believe is immaterial, but what is true remains constant. How do you know what's true, then? Because I've seen them myself, just as you described. The old man gestured back to the floor, and Nox took his seat once again, the look of surprise clear on his face. Those of us who commune with magic have a lot more connection than you might realize. There's a reason King Ludari doesn't want his subjects to practice the arcane. It undermines his power, his and his false god. Then what about this dark figure Noxus? Has seen? Zuk asked. Is that a god too? I am not certain. It's possible it was just your dreams taking over, although it does cause me some concern. That and the existence of the Draugia in the hollow. Until now, I thought that kind of magic impossible. He took another sip from his cup, and so did I. But one hears many things, and you are the first to mention dark things in the world. The thread of magic that runs through Licorice is growing thinner and weaker with every passing year. What's left feels warped and unfamiliar. At first I thought I was just getting weaker myself, but all the Witten have felt it across the tribes. Something is amiss, twisting the very essence of the world out of balance. But none of us can find an answer. Those who once communed with the gods in their youth, although a seldom occurrence, find it impossible now, blocked by an unknown force. Even the most powerful among us, greatly diminished. He paused for a moment. It's almost as if we have no power at all. What does that mean? Zyuk asked, his golden eyes fixed on the shaman. I wish I knew, my friend, he sighed. The only thing that's certain is that Licorice is dying, and nobody seems to know why. So I'm playing Endwalker right now. We're just doing an apocalyptic thing and that, and this is an apocalyptic thing, and I can't escape the apocalypse sads. The sad apocalypses of sads. Meh. I don't wanna be sad. I wanna be happy. But books and games are sad now. Will it get any happier in chapter 22? Nox paced around his hut in the dim firelight. Absolutely fucking useless, he muttered to himself. Dragged me all the way out here trying to help someone out, and nobody knows anything, nothing but wasted time and more false hope. They didn't see if he could read the instruction manual. That's what you're missing, Nox. You need to see if the shaman can read the instruction manual. He flopped down on the pile of furs near the small ring of stones, pulling his legs close and resting his head on his... Oh, sorry. I got a yawn, but then like a burp in the middle of the yawn. Irritation was burning at his stomach, fueled by a twinge of pain from the still healing spider bite. He didn't understand why he was getting so worked up. After all, he only came to the... That should be a came, right? Not... He only came to the village. Yeah. Came to the village to help Zyuk. But for some reason, the old man's lack of answers bothered him. He realized far too late that a small inkling of hope had been building inside of him. For the briefest of moments, he thought he'd learn about all the troubles he'd encountered the past week inside the Hollow, and maybe get an explanation. At the very least, he'd hoped for a way to take the ring off and go back to his normal life for good. But there was nothing besides a ridiculous theory about the gods and 1,000 more questions about magic. It's a good theory, Nox. It's a good theory. In fact, the only thing that hadn't come as a surprise was the observation that Licorice was dying. He just hadn't known that magic was dying along with it. It made sense, but also brought even more questions that he'd probably never get the answer to. But none of that mattered now. He had kept his promise and helped Zyuk find answers. Now it was time for him to go home, back to his ailing mother, who was probably worried sick about him, pun not intended. In fact, he wasn't going to wait any longer. Nox trudged over to the corner of the tent where Nullock had left him a small pack with some basic supplies. They were meant for the chaperoned journey in the morning, but it was a waste of time to go. He rummaged through, glancing over the water skin, the pouch of dried meat, the crystal he'd removed from his spear, a flint, and a small bundle of scrolls. And the small bundle of scrolls, the instruction manual. Knowing the thoughts rolling around his head, he was careful not to touch the scrolls, but he took a rolled up fur from the ground and stuffed it into the bag as well, throwing the pack over his shoulder. He grabbed his spear and made for the door. Just as his hand reached out to pull it aside, he stopped. He couldn't force himself to leave without telling Zyuk. As much as he knew his mother needed him, he knew she'd never approve of him leaving anyone without saying goodbye first, especially someone that he owed his life to. It didn't help that he'd grown to care for Zyuk. That, more than his upbringing, was what ate at him. Cursing under his breath, he pushed the leather flap aside, stomping out into the night in search of the tiny fox. The night had grown late, and the majority of the village was already in their huts. Even with no one around, Nox didn't feel entirely safe wandering around without Nuluk or the old shaman to escort him. He knew he was a stranger in their midst, and nobody, especially the chief, really trusted him. Even with an orc at his side, the villagers eyed him with suspicion and malice. Not that he could blame them. He felt the same way. None of them had given him a reason to be worried, but a lifetime of horror stories about their people wasn't something he could forget in a single day. Keeping to the shadows, Nox made his way to Niluk's quarters. As he approached the door, he could hear voices from within, one of them belonging to Zyuk. He leaned in close. They sounded happy. He could almost hear the smile on Zyuk's face as the fox talked excitedly about something he couldn't make out. He stopped for a moment, wondering if he should interrupt them. Zyuk, more than anyone, had been through the most in the past week, waking up in a strange, dangerous place where his life was constantly under threat. Probably wasn't the most comfortable of experiences. If Nox walked into the tent now, he'd ruin the moment of happiness that was seldom felt. Not to mention he'd have to deal with Nuluk as well, who wouldn't want him to leave until the morning, and she wasn't someone who could be overpowered or outmaneuvered. Taking a deep breath, Nox turned away from the hut, sneaking towards the eastern edge of the village. At the boundary, the grass sprang into its normal height, not tapered down by the constant flow of foot traffic from the orcs. He tilted his head back, staring into the night sky filled with stars. Hopefully Zyuk would forgive him for leaving without an explanation. It was unlikely they'd ever meet again, but silently, Nox wished him all the luck in the world with his quest. A part of him wished he could go too, but his mother needed him. It had already been far too long, and she'd be dangerously close to running out of medicine. If she hadn't already, she needed him, and her life depended on his quick retreat to Kald. He'd do whatever it took to save her. He just had to get there first. Maybe his new magic can do it. Making sure he wasn't spotted, he pushed into the grass that was already slick with dew. The valley came to an abrupt end a couple of 100 feet away, the grass fading away with it. He started to climb down the mountain itself, avoiding the nearby game trail in case there were orcs on guard duty. Keeping as quiet as possible, he struggled through the underbush, pushing his way towards the top. He thought of the Beldig. Back on the other side of the mountains, the yellow eyes glowing in the dark. Fear began to creep through his system, making his heart pound in his ears as he walked. More than once, his senses on high alert as tiny sounds echoed through the forest. Every snap of a twig or rustle of the leaves sent a rush of adrenaline through his system. He'd almost forgotten what it was like to be on his own in dangerous places. By the time he reached the top of the mountain, he was exhausted, dripping in sweat. He leaned against a nearby tree, trying to breathe as quietly as he could. The wilds of the world were definitely not for him. Sneaking through the streets of Cald was intense enough when he didn't want to be caught. However, the fear of being hunted for the sole sake of being eaten was a newer experience he wanted to stop repeating. I mean, the dragon didn't want to eat him at least, so it's only happened twice. He shook his head, glancing up and down the ridgeline. As far as he knew, nothing was following him. He hoped. But as he looked down the mountain to the eastern plains, he saw something else that made him pause. There was a group of fires at the bottom, like a sort of camp had been set up. Well, shit. He squinted in the dark, trying to make out the details in the pale moonlight high overhead. When they began to shift, he realized they weren't fires, but torches. Dark figures, some on horseback, massed around the torches. Shouts echoed up the mountain, but they were indiscernible over the long distance, their words lost in the trees. One figure, leading the rest, came into the torchlight atop his mount. Nox caught a flash of his blood-red cloak in the firelight and the glimmer of armor. It was the Holy Knights. He watched as they approached the base of the mountain and slipped into the trees at a steady pace. They were headed his way. Without so much of a second thought, Nox turned on his heel and sprinted down the mountainside. Dodging back and forth with no regard for the amount of noise he was making, he descended, grabbing branches and bush to slow himself down as he skidded down the steep hillside. Nox ran as fast as he could. More than once he heard something in the trees startle and take off, but he never stopped to see what it could be. Nothing in the woods could be worse than what was on its way to the village. As much as he needed to get home, he couldn't leave Zyuk to be slaughtered along with the others, and by the time the watch noticed the knights coming, it would be too late. He had to get there first and warn them. Nox came barreling out of the bottom of the hill, the sudden change in incline nearly throwing him to the ground. He crashed through the grass, dew pushing through his clothing and soaking him to the skin. Calls rose up around him as he rushed for the village. In his periphery, he saw an orc guard take off running towards him, shouting in a language he didn't understand. A horn bellowed from the opposite direction, signaling the people in the village that something was amiss. Even with the hulking orc coming towards him, Nox didn't stop. Instead, he put on a burst of speed, running as fast as he could toward Nulloch's abode. He took a moment to glance back as he drew near. Behind him, the orc had unsheathed a long curved sword with a hooked end that looked as if it could tear his leg off in a clean sweep. The orc was nearly on top of him. Nox forced his way through the leather door, throwing himself into the hut without warning. He crashed to the ground, nearly crushing Zyuk in the process, who yelped and skidded to the opposite side of the room. Nulloch was caught by surprise and had a hand on her maul before he had a chance to take a breath. The other orc cried out, ripping the door aside, pulling his sword back to strike. Nox held up crossed arms to shield himself, clenching his eyes shut in preparation for the pain. There was a loud crash of metal on metal that caused him to startle, but there was no pain. Opening his eyes, he looked up to see Nulloch holding her maul in one hand, the sword buried in the handle only inches away from her. "Stop!" she shouted at the guard. "He's a friend of Witten Gruul, and of the tribe." The orc pulled his sword back, unsticking it from the handle of her maul. "He rushed him from outside the village," I didn't know he was in the dark. Nulloch's gaze turned to Nox. Outside of the village? What are you doing there? Nox saw Zyuk take a few steps forward, his eyes reflecting in the firelight as he looked over the spear and bag strapped across his back. Nox? None of that is important. Nox puffed, still trying to catch his breath as he lay flat on the ground. The knights are here. They're coming over the mountain tonight. What? Nulloch asked, suddenly serious. What do you mean they're here? I saw them at the top of the mountain. They're less than an hour away. Nulloch turned to the old guard. Wake up Chief Varfu and the rest of the village. Tell them to arm themselves. The orc hesitated for a moment. Now, I said. In a flash, the guard orc was gone, tearing out of the tent and across the village. Zyuk walked over to Nox, pushing his head against his arm in an attempt to help him to his feet. Aw, sweet boy. Sweet fluffy boy. Nulloch reached down with one hand and lifted him from the ground, placing him back on his feet with ease. She brushed him off with a big meaty hand and looked him square in the eyes. We need to prepare for the knights, she said seriously, and both of you need to get the hell out of here. I'm sorry? Nox began feeling the urge to confess, to trying to abandon them. No time for that. Her gaze was more grave than he'd seen before. We should be thankful you were out there. Without you, we would have been blind until it was too late. She looked him up and down. I see you already have your things. You and Zyuk need to get as far away from here as possible before the knights arrive. What? We can't do that, Zyuk started. Yes, you can, and you will, she stated firmly. The knights are only here for one reason. Blood. And if they find you here, you can bet they'll kill you or worse. She turned her gaze to Zyuk, the hard edges of her mouth softening. Don't make me a witness to that. But we can help. No, you can't. Now you need to go. She reached out and put a hand on Nox's shoulder. You take him with you. You take good care of him, you hear? Nox could see the plea in her eyes. He knew they were both thinking the same thing. By the time the sun rose, there was a distinct possibility that the Nimbanda tribe of the orcs would be no more. Zyuk wasn't safe with them, and neither was he. I will. I promise, he replied without hesitation. Good. Now go. Before they cut off your path, and path to the other side of the mountain. But Nulloch, Zyuk whined, trotting up to her. She reached down and scooped him up, nuzzling him in her arms. Nox was caught off guard by the familiar show of affection. It was soft and delicate, reminding him of how his own mother used to comfort him as a child. Now you need to go, she whispered. Don't worry, me and the others will do our best to defend the village. She leaned her head down and touched her forehead to his. There are things out there that you need to do. Dying for this village isn't part of your path, little one. Zyuk looked like he was about to cry. I'm about to cry. His eyes glassy in the firelight. Outside the village was starting to come alive. Shouts echoed across the valley, waking everyone from their slumber. In the distance, Nox could make out the distinct voice of Chief Varfu calling orders over the chaos. The cries of the people filled the night, and a terrible sense of dread crept into his body. After all all the years of horror stories about the orcs. It wasn't until that moment he realized how helpless they truly were against the king. Just like him. Dozens of well-equipped soldiers were on their way to fight a village full of normal people, defended by a handful of warriors. They were horribly outnumbered and outmatched. Nuluk caught his eye and nodded, pulling Zyuk from her body. "Take him," she murmured, a single tear falling down her cheek. Fuck! I can't believe this teary face opens a new tab every time. Get out of here. Nox reached out and took Zyuk from her, even though he was struggling. "Thank you for all your help." "Thank you for all your help." He paused for a moment. "And I don't know if it matters, but I'm sorry for the things I said. I'll keep my promise to you. Both of them." Nuluk nodded slowly. "It matters. And thank you." With one last nod, Nox pushed the leather flap aside and darted out of the tent, holding a struggling Zyuk close to his chest. He raced across the village, heading for the southeast corner. Knowing the soldiers would come straight up and over the mountain, their only chance of survival was to avoid them completely. "Let me go!" Nyuk cried over his shoulder, wriggling in his arms. Nox didn't listen. Instead, he kept a tight hold until they reached the chest-high grass, where he skidded to a stop and knelt down. He pulled Zyuk away from his body, holding him by the scruff of the neck. The fox made a few pathetic noises, but Nox didn't care. "Let me go!" he repeated. Nox gave him a hard shake. "Stop it," he growled, gritting his teeth. "Quiet down and listen to me." "No! Nuluk needs our help! They all do!" "And what are you going to do, huh?" Nox glared at him, not loosening his grip in the slightest. "Can you bite through steel armor?" "Hold a sword?" "No! You can't even do enough magic to scorch the grass with that wound of yours. You're useless." Nook's ears dropped. As he stopped struggling. "I want to help them as much as you do, but we don't stand a chance against the knights. You don't understand what they can do, what they are capable of." Nox stared into the golden eyes, willing the fox to understand. Their primes are after the orcs, and if there's one of them in that group, they'll be unstoppable. But what about Nuluk and the others? Yeah. Nox stood up and held the fox over the grass, pointing him back towards the village. There were dozens of orcs running about. A few were armed, but the majority had hastily packed bags slung over their shoulders. Some were already pushing towards the southwestern side of the village and starting up the mountain path. "Look," Nox said, pointing back at the village. "Nuluk and the others know what they are up against. They aren't stupid enough to start a war. They're just going to run, just like we are." Nox felt the fox relax as he pulled him closer, cradling him against his chest. "But they'll likely be pursued, and that's why you couldn't stay. The only thing that can help them now is luck and quick feet. Do you think they'll make it?" Nox hugged the fox tight. "I hope so." He leaned back, looking Zyuk in the eye. Will you come back with me to Cald? Zyuk stared back at him, his head crooked to the side. But I thought you didn't want me. That's why you left. Oh. This is already upsetting enough, and now we have this poor sad fox being sad. Pain. I know I tried to leave, but it wasn't because I didn't want you. Nox sighed. The world is dangerous. What I don't want is to put you in danger. And that's all we'll find in Cald. What about the Clavis? We can figure that out another time. But what about... My mother is dying, okay? Nox yelled, no longer able to hold back his frustration. I have to get home to her so I can try save her, alright? I'm the only person in the she has in the whole world. I don't have time to argue with you. Zyuk's ears pinned to his head at the sudden outburst. He stared at Nox for a long moment, his gold eyes flickering back and forth. Why didn't you say something? You fucking dumbass! I would have been with you from the start! Nox didn't answer. He just looked away. Yes! Sorry, having fun with that expressions for a minute there. I just kind of lost where I was. Yes, Nox replied after a moment. I'll go to Cald with you. Maybe I can help. A sigh of relief escaped Nox's lips, and suddenly he felt ashamed of his outburst. But there was no time to talk about it. Good. We need to go. Zyuk nodded, and Nox lifted him up to his shoulder, knowing the fox's back leg was still too injured for him to walk along, much less run. Together they pushed through the tall grass, the dew seeping into their clothes. Why are we saying there when we're not talking about... We're talking about one person again? Ooh. We've had a couple of grammar issues. Their clothes and fur. I guess that's why, because he put the and at the end, and I was an idiot and didn't read to the end of the sentence. Whoop-de-doo. They didn't stop to look back as they plunged into the forest, climbing the steep incline. Shouts and cries continued to echo through the valley, filling the night with their panic. It wasn't until Nox reached the ridgeline that he took a moment to catch his breath. A loud boom forced him to turn around, looking back down at the valley below. Both he and Zyuk froze. The village was on fire, the flames spreading to each hut one by one. A single figure... Oh, okay, 1 second. I'm sorry. Throat needs hydration. A single figure atop a horse sat with his cloak billowing in the breeze, his armoured arm grasping wickedly at a curved glaive. He lifted his free hand with his palm facing outwards. Nox stared in disbelief as bright balls of energy coalesced around him from thin air, forming a single ball of bright red light hovering a few inches in front of his palm. Without so much as a flinch, the ball suddenly streaked forward and exploded against one of the huts. The structure was blown to bits as the deep boom echoed across the valley. Dozens of the other armed figures rushed in, illuminated by the sudden conflagration, as their leader looked on, letting his arm drop to his side casually. The knight's swords flashed as they fought the orcs that had remained behind. Even from a distance, Nox could see the crimson on their blades. He'd been right. One of the primes had been leading the charge. They were the only ones allowed by the king to use magic. Nothing else could explain what he'd seen. Nox closed his eyes, knowing there was nothing he could do. There wasn't anyone in the world that was a match for the primes. You will be if you could use your magic ring. Without a word, he turned back towards the east, crossing over the top of the mountain with Zyuk staring over his shoulder at the slaughter behind them. Oh fuck, that was horrible. I don't like it. I don't like it. It's a good book, but it hurts me. It hurts. That whole tribe could be gone. At least him and Zyuk are now on the same page. That's a good thing. And it's like, bitch, you like fuzzy wuzzy babies, so why don't you just accept that you have a pet fox now? People would die for this shit. But that is where I'm going to end it for today, I think. Yes. We are now 83% of the way through. So it's probably only about 2 more streams left of this, and then we'll be through the whole book. But I do have some maybe not an announcement, I guess, but I am not going to be streaming next week at all. Because for 2 reasons. One, I would like a nice break. I need to recharge my batteries. I would like to look into maybe getting a new background, because there's been a lot of hoo-ha about AI art, and I didn't really think about it when I made this. So I would like to make up for that issue. At some point. I've been looking into a couple of artists. Hopefully I can get something. Maybe not done in the week, but something ordered. That'd be nice. I'd also like to figure out my review schedule for the books, because as much as it's been good sort of just doing the whole da-da-da and a quick summary, it'd be nice to actually do like my full reviews. Need to figure that out again. But the main reason is because apparently I'm allowed to leave this magical forbidden library of mine, if I have work-related traveling to be done. So I am having to travel for work next week, which is a pain in the butt, but gotta be done. I do want to be paid. It should be the only time I have to do it, so hopefully it's the only time I have to do it. And then it'll be out the way. And I can come back the week after, recharged and happy. But the week after that, I won't actually be reading Exordium anyway! So you're gonna have to wait like 2 weeks again for the next part of Exordium, which is sad. But I do plan on doing some spooky short stories on my next Storytime Sunday, because it will be close to Halloween. So I've got a few short stories of my own, which maybe aren't that spooky, but are like Halloween themed. One that has a lot of swear words, which I'm not sure I'm going to do because of the sheer amount of swear words in it. And there's also Edgar Allan Poe short stories, which are fun. So I'll probably be doing maybe some of them. Look forward to it. Either way, I had fun. I hope you had fun. Thank you for coming. This has been Brainy Rose Smith from the Forbidden Library. Bye-bye. See, this is usually a slideshow ending, but because I don't have a schedule for next week, it's actually just this, so enjoy!